The rain didn't cleanse. It just made the cracked asphalt of the small southern town gleam under the night sky. On the corner, a flickering neon sign buzzed low. Electric hum. Danny's Tavern, it read, and beneath that, the cruel punchline, "Welcome to good company." The door swung open, and the bar's chatter died. Two men walked in. Twin brothers Daniel and David Thompson. They carried a stillness that felt alien in the noisy room. They just wanted a drink. Every eye in the place tracked them. Hard, white stares from a sea of familiar faces. Behind the bar, Louise froze, a glass in her hand, her face a conflict of politeness and deep-seated fear. In a corner booth, off-duty Officer Brett Coleman set his beer down with a quiet thud. He nudged his colleagues, Rick Torres and Jake Morrison. "You think they're lost?" he muttered, not bothering to whisper. Jake snorted. "Nah, they're here for attention. Gotta be." Brett stood up, his swagger claiming the space between the tables. He stopped in front of the brothers, a smile plastered on his face that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Evening, fellas," he said, the word a deliberate insult. "Let's save everyone some trouble. Finish your drinks somewhere else, before this gets uncomfortable." Daniel turned slowly. His brother, David, didn't. He remained half a step behind, his eyes doing a silent, methodical scan of the room. The exits, the faces, the potential threats. "We're just here for a drink," Daniel said, his voice level and calm. A memory, sharp and unbidden. Teenage Daniel and David, pressed against the cold metal patrol car, flashing lights painting their faces. A cop's knee in Daniel's back. Just fitting a description. The officer had sneered. The same feeling of helpless rage, now forged into ice-cold control. Brett leaned in, his beer-soaked breath hot. "We run this town," he whispered, the word venomous. Daniel didn't blink. His gaze was steady, fearless. "Then it's being run poorly." The silence in the bar was absolute. Brett's laugh cut through it, a sharp, ugly sound. "You hear that?" he announced to the room. "He thinks we're doing a bad job." The air turned to lightning. Daniel kept his hands in plain sight on the bar. "Just our bill, then," Daniel said. Brett shifted, deliberately blocking the path to the door. "What's the rush? We're just getting acquainted." From the booth, Jake held up his phone, the screen glowing. "Smile for the folks at home, boys," he mocked. Daniel slowly, deliberately, slid his untouched drink to the side, clearing space. It wasn't a gesture of fear, but a precision. Rick, the older cop, spoke up, his voice heavy. "Brett, let it go." "Stay out of it, Rick." Brett snapped, his eyes locked on Daniel. He jabbed a finger, stopping an inch from Daniel's chest. "You gonna do something?" "Huh." David stood. It wasn't a sudden move. It was unfolding. A promise of violence held in check by a will of iron. His voice was flat, deadly. "Don't touch him again." Brett smirked, all teeth. "Or what?" Another memory. David, in a desert world away, the air thick with sand and the crack of gunfire. The same calm on his face. The same focus. A different war, the same soldier. Louise's voice trembled from behind the bar. "Brett, please. That's enough." But it wasn't. Daniel's hand went to the inside of his jacket. Brett flinched. But it wasn't a weapon. It was a worn leather wallet. Daniel placed it on the sticky bar top and flipped it open. A gold badge gleamed, catching the flickering neon light. Brett's smirk vanished. His brain tried to catch up. David's eyes never left him. "That's my brother's," he said, his voice still that chilling calm. "You still want to see mine?" On Jake's phone, the recording screen shook in his hand. Brett stared at the badge, his mind racing. "Captain Daniel Thompson?" he scoffed, the bravado cracking. "That's a cute trick. Where'd you steal it?" Daniel said nothing. His composure was a wall. Rick stepped closer, his face pale. "Brett, stop. That's real." "Shut up." Brett's voice rose, desperate. "You believe this?" And then Daniel spoke, softly, a hammer blow wrapped in velvet. "We've met before, Brett. You were shaking when you cuffed me at 17. The world stopped. A beer bottle slipped from Brett's hand and shattered on the floor. The rain had started again outside as they stepped into the parking lot. The neon welcome sign flickered overhead. Brett followed them out, desperate to reclaim his crumbling dominance. "You think anyone will believe you?" "Over me," he spat. Daniel just walked, slow and deliberate. David's voice cut through the drizzle, sharp as a knife. "You're drunk, and you're out of line." Brett surged forward, shoving Daniel. A clumsy, angry lunge. Daniel sidestepped. Effortless. David caught Brett's wrist mid-swing, held it for a single, terrifying second, long enough for Brett to feel the impossible, coiled strength, and then let go. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Louise had called for backup. Real cops. Brett's face was a mask of pale fury. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." Daniel looked at him, rain on his face. "No, Brett, I think you just made yours." Flashing lights painted the wet asphalt. The arriving squad car doors opened. Brett, slurring, pointed. "They threatened me, impersonating officers." Daniel simply handed his badge to the sergeant. The sergeant's eyes widened. "Captain Thompson, sir?" The word "sir" landed like a judge's gavel. The air shifted violently. The other officers lowered their hands from their weapons. Brett's confusion turned to pure panic. "He's lying. He's lying." The sergeant keyed his radio, his voice tight. "Confirm identity. Captain Daniel Thompson. Internal Affairs." Then David stepped forward. He flashed a different ID. "Commander David Thompson. U.S. Navy SEALs." Silence. The only sound was the rain and the static from the police radio. Brett's voice broke. "You set me up." Daniel shook his head, his eyes holding a profound, weary truth. "No, Brett. You set yourself up the moment you decided who I was by looking at me." The sergeant read Brett his rights. As he was led to a squad car, Brett spat. "This isn't over." Daniel watched him go, his face unreadable, until his phone buzzed. The caller ID, Internal Affairs HQ. He answered, "Yes, I'm here." A pause. His expression changed. "What?" "When?" He stood in the pouring rain. The phone pressed his ear, learning that Brett's abuse of power had a body count. That tonight wasn't a coincidence, but a collision course with hidden truth. David urged him to walk away. "You did enough." Daniel looked at his brother, resolve hardening in his eyes. "No, if we stay silent, it keeps happening." He walked back toward the lights, toward the truth that needed a voice. Louise approached, her face etched with shame. "For what it's worth," she whispered, "I'm sorry." Daniel's reply was quiet, final. "Don't be. Just remember who stayed silent tonight." As they walked away, the neon sign flickered one last time. The word "welcome" finally went dark, and the town was a little quieter, a little truer in the rain. They didn't need to raise their voices. The truth did that for them. "Shut up, Rick." Brett's voice rose, desperate and angry. He was losing control of the room, and he knew it. "You believe this? You think some civilian just happens to be a captain? Here." "He's not a civilian, Brett," Rick said, the words hanging in the air. Brett's eyes darted from Rick's worried face back to Daniel's impassive one. The math wasn't adding up, and his prejudice couldn't compute the answer. The foundation of his world, where he was the ultimate authority in this room, was cracking. And then Daniel spoke. Softly, a hammer blow wrapped in velvet. "We've met before, Brett." The bar was so quiet the buzz of the neon sign sounded like a scream. Daniel's eyes locked onto his. "You were shaking when you cuffed me at 17. On the corner of Elm and Pine. You and your training officer. You kept apologizing. He told you to shut up." Recognition, slow and horrifying, dawned on Brett's face. The memory, long buried under a decade of bluster and power, surged forward. A skinny kid, scared but defiant, his own hands fumbling with the cuffs, his heart hammering with a rookie's fear. The shame of that night, of being so visibly unnerved, came flooding back. A beer bottle slipped from Brett's slackened grip and shattered on the floor. The sound was deafening. The spell was broken. The tension snapped, replaced by a chaotic energy. "That's it. You're under arrest." Brett yelled, the words slurred with panic and alcohol. He lunged forward, grabbing for Daniel's arm. It was a clumsy telegraph move. Daniel sidestepped with an effortless grace that was more insulting than any shove. Brett stumbled past him. David was there. He didn't strike. He didn't grapple. He simply caught Brett's wrist mid-swing, his grip like steel. He held it for a single, terrifying second, long enough for Brett to feel the impossible, coiled strength, to understand the absolute physical dominance being held in check. Then, with a look of utter contempt, he let go. Brett staggered back, clutching his wrist, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His face was a mask of pale, drunken fury. The other patrons were on their feet now, phones raised, recording the downfall. "Louise, call the real police," someone shouted from the back. Daniel and David began moving toward the door, a unified force. Brett, humiliated and unraveling, scrambled after them into the wet parking lot, his colleagues trailing in a confused, hesitant pack. The rain had picked up, cooling the night air. The neon welcome sign flickered overhead, a final, cruel joke. "You think anyone will believe you? Over me?" Brett spat, water streaming down his face. He was a drowning man clutching at the ropes of his privilege. "My word against yours. I'm a cop." David's voice cut through the drizzle, sharp as a knife. "You're drunk, and you're out of line." Brett surged forward again, this time with a wild, frustrated shove aimed at Daniel's back. It was a pathetic, hopeless gesture. Daniel, as if sensing it coming, turned and sidestepped again, the motion so fluid it seemed choreographed. Brett stumbled and fell to one knee on the wet asphalt, grunting in pain and humiliation. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Louise had called for backup. Real cops. Brett looked up from the ground, rain and tears of rage mixing on his face. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," he snarled, his voice breaking. Daniel looked down at him, his expression not of anger, but profound, weary pity. "No, Brett," he said, his voice barely louder than the rain. "I think you just made yours." Flashing lights painted the wet asphalt in pulses of blue and red. The arriving squad car doors opened, and two uniformed officers stepped out, their postures immediately alert the scene before them. Two composed black men standing over a kneeling, hysterical off-duty officer. The system had arrived. The question now was, who would it protect? The parking lot was a tableau of stark contrast under the pulsing police lights. Brett Coleman, kneeling on the wet asphalt, soaked and disheveled. Daniel and David Thompson, standing calm and still as statues in the rain. The arriving officers, Officers Miller and Evans stepped out of their cruiser, hands resting on their belts. "What's the situation here?" Officer Miller called out, his voice cutting through the rain. Brett scrambled to his feet, pointing a shaking finger. "They assaulted me. They flashed fake badges, threatened me. Arrest them." Officer Miller's gaze shifted to the twins. He saw their calm composure, their measured stance. "Sir, can you tell me what happened?" he asked Daniel. Before Daniel could speak, Brett interjected, his voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "They're lying. I'm a cop. You know me, Miller." "Brett, let him speak," Officer Miller said, his tone firm. Daniel slowly reached for his inside pocket. "Easy now," Officer Evans said, his posture tensing. "My identification," Daniel said calmly. He produced a leather wallet again and handed it to Officer Miller. Miller opened it. His eyes scanned the badge and the ID card behind it. His posture changed instantly. His shoulders went back, his spine straightened. He looked from the ID to Daniel's face, then back again. "Captain Thompson," he said, his voice laced with disbelief and a new, profound respect. "Sir," the word "sir" landed in the wet air with the force of a physical blow. Brett's face went slack with shock. "What?" Brett whispered. "No, he's lying, Miller. It's a fake." "It's not a fake, Brett," Miller said, his voice low and serious. He looked at Daniel. "Internal affairs. We heard you were coming to town. Sir, we didn't expect this." David spoke now, his voice still that flat, calm tone. "You want to see mine?" He didn't wait for an answer. Producing his own ID, Commander David Thompson, Naval Special Warfare. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the rain and the static from the police radio. The hierarchy in the parking lot had been utterly inverted. The two men Brett had tried to intimidate weren't just above him in rank. They were in a different stratosphere of authority and respect. Jake Morrison, who had been filming everything on his phone, slowly lowered his hand, the device now feeling like a lead weight. Rick Torres stood by his truck, his head bowed, looking physically ill. Officer Miller handed Daniel's badge back with a reverent nod. He then turned to Brett. Brett Coleman, you are under arrest for public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and assault. The words seemed to barely register. Brett was staring through Daniel, his mind crumbling. You set me up. He breathed, a mantra of denial. Daniel took a step forward, close enough that only Brett could hear him over the rain and the muffled sounds of Miranda rights being recited. No, Brett, Daniel said, his voice quiet but absolute. You set yourself up the moment you decided who I was by looking at me. As Officer Miller guided a handcuffed Brett toward the squad car, Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. The screen glowed in the dim light. Internal Affairs HQ. He answered, Yes, I'm here. He listened, his face, which had been a mask of control calm, began to change. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed with a dawning, grim understanding. What? He said, his voice sharp. When? He ended the call and stood motionless in the rain. The phone pressed his ear long after the call had ended. The confrontation was over, but the case was just beginning, and it was far uglier than he could have imagined. Daniel stood frozen in the rain, the phone a cold piece of plastic in his hand. The voice from Internal Affairs echoed in his mind, detailing the ugly truth they had been building towards. Marcus Green, 34 years old, picked up by Coleman and Morrison 6 weeks ago on a dubious DUI. Witnesses stated he was sober. The arrest was aggressive. He died in custody an hour later. The official report claimed he fell and hit his head, but the coroner's report inconsistencies. We've been building a case, Captain, but we needed a catalyst. Someone to break the silence. They had used him. IA knew Brett's habits, knew this bar was his personal fiefdom. They had hoped Daniel's presence might trigger something, but they could never have predicted this. His presence hadn't just been a catalyst. It had been a detonation. David came to stand beside him. What is it? Daniel relayed the information in a low, tight voice. A man is dead, David. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about murder. The word hung between them, heavy and final. Across the parking lot, the second squad car door was open. Officer Miller was reading Jake his rights. Jake, who had been Brett's partner the night Marcus Green died. His face was a ghastly shade of pale, his earlier bravado completely gone. He was no longer just an accomplice to tonight's disgrace. He was a suspect in a death. Daniel's eyes swept the scene. The flashing lights, the gathered crowd with their phones, the stunned faces of the other bar patrons. This was no longer a personal confrontation. It was a public spectacle, and it had to become a public reckoning. He walked towards Sergeant Miller, who was coordinating the scene. Sergeant, Daniel said, his voice carrying a new, official weight. There's been a development. You need to secure Officer Morrison's phone as evidence. Immediately. And I need you to call your watch commander. Now. Miller nodded, his expression grim, and moved to comply. Daniel then turned and walked toward the small crowd, toward the cameras that were now recording. He wasn't in uniform, but he stood with the authority of one. The rain plastered his hair to his head and ran in rivulets down his face, but he seemed not to notice. My name is Captain Daniel Thompson, he began, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of the night. For too long, the badge has been used as a shield for few, instead of protection for the many. He paused, let his gaze sweep over the faces. Some fearful, some angry, some just curious. That ends tonight. Not because of me, but because silence is a disease. The price of that silence is a man named Marcus Green. He didn't look at the squad cars holding Brett and Jake. He looked at Rick Torres, who was still leaning against his truck, a broken man. He looked at Sergeant Miller, who had admitted to looking the other way. He looked at Louise, still standing in the doorway of the bar, her hand over her mouth. "The power of this badge," Daniel said, tapping his own, "isn't in the metal. It's in the truth it's sworn to uphold. And the truth doesn't care about your uniform. It only cares that you listen." As he finished, a hush fell. The spectacle was over, but the reckoning had just begun. David came to stand beside him, a solid, silent pillar of support. In the back of the squad car, Brett Coleman stared out the rain streaked window. The rage was still there, but was now dwarfed by a dawning, terrifying realization. He wasn't just facing a suspension or even assault charges. He was facing the consequences of an entire life built on a lie of superiority, a lie that had just been publicly dismantled, a lie that had led to a man's death. Daniel and David turned and walked away from the lights, leaving the broken pieces of the old order behind them. They had come for a quiet drink, and in doing so, had started a war for the soul of the town. A war that, for the first time, justice had a chance of winning. The story didn't end in the parking lot. It exploded. The shaky phone footage from Jake's own device was entered into evidence, and, despite legal efforts to suppress it, its contents leaked. It was all there. The swagger, the slurred threats, the badge, the cold, calm revelation of identity. The town and then the nation couldn't look away. Daniel and David didn't give interviews. They didn't need to. The video was the prosecutor's star witness, and their silent, powerful presence in it was more damning than any soundbite. The fallout was swift and brutal. Brett Coleman and Jake Morrison were formally charged with the manslaughter of Marcus Green, evidence tampering, and a host of civil rights violations. The system, now under a blistering microscope, had no choice but to turn on its own. Rick Torres, in a move that shocked the department, resigned. Then he walked into the district attorney's office and offered to testify. His statement wasn't just about that night at Danny's. It was about a pattern, a culture of willful blindness. He spoke of locker room talk that crossed a line, of complaints that were lost, of the corrosive fear being ostracized for speaking up. His testimony provided the context, the ecosystem that had allowed Brett's behavior to fester. It was the nail in the coffin. Sergeant Miller was reassigned to desk duty. The blue wall had crumbled, not with bang, but with a series of quiet administrative transfers and early retirements. The town's police department was getting a forced, painful cleanse. A week after the incident, Daniel went alone to the funeral of Marcus Green. It was a quiet, somber affair in a small church on the other side of town. He sat in the back, in a simple, dark suit, his head bowed. He didn't know this man, but he felt a connection to him. A man who had been failed by the same system Daniel had sworn to uphold. After the service, an older woman with Marcus's eyes approached him. "You're him, aren't you?" she said, her voice soft but steady. "The captain?" Daniel nodded. "I am. I'm so sorry for your loss, ma'am." She studied his face, looking for the anger, the pity, the politics. She found none. "My boy wasn't a saint," she said, "but he was a good man. He didn't deserve to die in a cold cell for a crime he didn't commit." She placed a frail hand on his arm. "Thank you for not being silent." In that moment, the weight of the last week shifted for Daniel. It was no longer about winning a confrontation or exposing corruption. It was about this: a mother getting a fragment of peace. It was about restoring a shred of dignity to a name that had been smeared. Weeks turned into a month. The national news vans packed up and left, but the change in the town was palpable. A community oversight board was formed, when Marcus Green's mother offered a founding seat. Daniel and David met for a drink, not at Danny's, which had closed its doors for good, its flickering sign taken down, but at a quiet, neutral pub near the river. The silence between them was comfortable. The bond forged in the fire that night stronger than ever. "You know they're not going to make you chief, don't you?" David said, swirling the ice in his glass. "You're a hero to some, but you're also a walking reminder to shame. The department hates a reminder." Daniel smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "I know. I don't want it anyway." He looked out at the flowing water, dark and steady under the night sky. "Internal affairs offer me a permanent position, head of a new division focused on ethics and community relations. It's a desk job. David raised an eyebrow. You? A desk job? It's where I'm needed, Daniel replied, his gaze still on the water. It's not about the adrenaline anymore. It's about building something that lasts. Making sure what happened to Marcus Green, what almost happened to us, doesn't happen again. It's about changing the soil, not just plucking the weeds. David nodded, understanding. His war had been overseas against clear enemies. Daniel's war was here, in the heart of his own home, a slow, grinding battle for the soul of an institution. One evening, Daniel found himself driving past the old Danny's Tavern. The building was dark, boarded up, the parking lot empty. The cracked asphalt was the same, but the oppressive atmosphere was gone. It was just a building now. He pulled over and got out. He stood there for a long time, not with anger or triumph, but with a quiet sense of resolution. The bar had been a cage, a symbol of everything wrong. Now it was nothing. As he turned to leave, he saw a for lease sign staked in the weedy lawn, a blank slate. He got back in his car. The corner was just a corner now. The story was over, and a new one was beginning. He started the engine and drove home, the headlights cutting a path through the gathering dusk. They didn't need to raise their voices. The truth had done that for them, and its echo was finally, blessedly, fading into a better future.